This is Father Vogel. We continue our series on St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. We are in part 3, looking at the different virtues, and we are looking at the 3 evangelical counsels of poverty, chastity, and obedience. St. Francis started with obedience in the previous chapter, and now we move on to speaking of chastity, which he'll cover in 2 chapters. So introduce chastity in this chapter of the video we're going to be doing right now, and the next video we'll look at specific advice that he gives for how to maintain the virtue of chastity. So chastity, he says, is the lily of virtues. It renders men almost equal to the angels. So chastity has to do with the use of our body and our sexuality, the way God created us as men and women, in its proper way. So he says that it is never permitted to derive any sexual pleasure from our bodies in any way whatsoever, except in lawful marriage. So when it comes to the use of our sexuality, it must be done in the proper way, and you're not allowed to derive pleasure, sexual pleasure, unless one does so within marriage, though he says even in marriage the purity of intention is to be kept, because chastity isn't simply, not engaging in sexual relations, but it has to do, there's a spiritual aspect primarily. So he says purity of intention. So he says, first, do not admit any kind of sexual pleasure, which is forbidden and prohibited. So he doesn't go into all those examples, but I think, for most of us that are looking at deepening our spiritual life, we kind of know what those things that are prohibited in that area include. And if you're unsure, there's plenty of resources, but that's a bit more that we can go into in just this reflection. So then, after saying no to anything that's forbidden, then he says, but restrain also yourselves as far as possible from useless and superfluous delights, although lawful and permitted. So what may be allowed within marriage, you still have to, it doesn't mean anything goes within marriage, that just because one is married, then any kind of sexual act is then allowed within the context of marriage. And even for those that are lawful and permitted, he says that you want to refrain yourself from useless and superfluous delights. So, we often refer to the act of sexual intercourse as the one flesh union. And so, all of those acts are meant to make the husband and wife one. And so if there's actions that don't have that as part of it, then it's not the proper use of sexuality. And he also says that not to set your affections on sensual pleasures, you must not be attached to them. So in previous chapters we talked about not being attached to things that may be permitted, but could draw us away because we become so fixated upon them. So one area in which this can be rather strong is in the area of our sexuality. And so the virtue of chastity helps us to kind of moderate the use of our sexuality so that it's for its proper end, which is the union of spouses and this expression of love to one another, and not simply really the opposite of love, as Pope John Paul II explained, is using the other person. So if you're using, even within marriage, the spouse for one's own pleasure and not really giving of yourself for their good, then that's not, it's more of an attachment than anything else. He goes on to give some advice specifically to widows. He says widows should resist the imaginations which pleasures lawfully taken in marriage may produce in their minds. So prior to them being widows, when widows or widowers, where their spouse was alive, they engaged in renewing their wedding vows, the one flesh union, something that was very good. And of course there's pleasure as part of that, but there can be imaginations hearkening back to when their spouse was alive after now the spouse is no longer there. And so he says to resist those imaginations, because that can, there can be temptations to, I want to experience that again, and to then seek out ways that are unlawful. So you want to be careful even with those imaginations. He speaks then to virgins. So virgins would be anybody who is not married, not simply those that are consecrated virgins, but anybody who is not within marriage, and so that means you're not free to engage in those kinds of sexual acts. So he says that virgins should banish from their hearts all kinds of curious thoughts. So any of that kind of, daydreaming or imagining about what those actions might be, you want to especially guard thoughts from that kind of curiosity in that area. He uses an analogy to explain that just how enticing it can be, and at the same time dangerous. He says, the little moth, seeing the flame, curiously flutters around it to find out if it is as sweet as it seems to be beautiful. Urged by this fantasy, it does not stop till it is lost in the first attempt. So those fantasies, imaginations, especially in the area of sexuality, if we can kind of flutter around it like, the moths that we see around a flame or a light, but as soon as the moth tries to go, into the beautiful light, then their life is destroyed. And so he says the same way, if we flutter around and entertain these imaginations, it will draw us in and until we fall, and it brings ruin to the virtue of chastity. Returning to chastity within marriage, he says chastity is very necessary for married people, even though a lot of common people may not think so. So chastity applies to all of us, not just those that aren't married, because chastity is not the same thing as abstinence or continence. Everyone needs to be chaste regardless of whether one is in marriage and able to renew their wedding vows through those actions, or whether they are single and so should refrain from all of those completely. So we must still be chaste. Observing moderation amidst such pleasures, it says, so you want to observe certain moderation. It says also that that oftentimes marriage will be given will be an excuse for people to be intemperate or lewd, to engage in certain things within marriage, but not all things are allowed, as kind of mentioned before. He says there's two kinds of chastity that you need to practice within marriage. And he says one part is a kind of absolute abstinence. And so that's when you're separated from your spouse. Sometimes spouses have a hard time with this idea of abstinence. It's of course very much essential to the use of natural family planning if a couple has a good reason to delay having a child. So that's one aspect of it. They're not renewing their wedding vows at every single moment. And so there's going to be moments in which the virtue of chastity requires married couples to abstain from renewing their wedding vows. So that's the first kind of chastity within marriage. And then another kind of chastity within marriage, he says, is moderation when they are together. So just as I mentioned before, you don't want it to become an attachment. You don't want to place greater love in the pleasure of the act than in the love of the other person themselves. He refers to one of the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God." So this is his start of describing of the virtue of chastity, and he will continue in the next chapter, and we'll continue in the next video and look at some more of his advice on how do we preserve and protect this virtue of chastity. God bless.